If you have a Bible with you, turn to the second chapter of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2. We'll be reading in there in a couple of minutes. We've been doing a series on the Ten Commandments, but we're taking a little break this Sunday because of the fact that it is, in our nation, Veterans Day. If memory serves, it was Armistice Day to begin with, which was commemorated the end of World War I. But over a period of time, it evolved to being Veterans Day, not just for that war, but for all the wars, and for all those people who have served in the armed services of the United States, whether they were involved in war or not. I am proud to be an American. I really am. And I very much admire and appreciate and honor every man and woman who has served in any part of our military service, either who has, who is, or who will at some point do so. And I'm very, very happy that you have that kind of courage and that kind of commitment, and thank you for what you do. My father was a master sergeant in the U.S. Army. My uncle was in the Navy. He was an enlisted man. I don't know what his rank was. I remember the last Navy base he was with was in Olathe, Kansas. Now just think about that for a minute. Why would you need a Navy base in Olathe, Kansas? Well, because it was an air base, believe it or not, and they needed some place for the planes to stop, the Navy planes, when they were flying across the country, and so that's where he was at that point. I have a son-in-law, Kimberly's husband, who is supposed to be made a captain this month in the U.S. Army, who is currently in South Korea. So not only do I admire it because I'm an American, obviously, I honor those people because of the fact that many people in my family have been, are now, and may in the future be. Now, if you say, okay, if you're going to put together a sermon about Veterans Day, where in the Bible does it talk about Veterans Day? Well, it doesn't. So then we stop and go, okay, since it doesn't talk about Veterans Day, why not? Well, because it's an American holiday, or not really a holiday so much as a day of honor, but it's American. One of the difficulties we have in reading our Bibles is because we read everything through the lenses of our own glasses. What that means is everything that I come into contact with, I have to interpret through what I already know. And if I don't know something, sometimes it can be very difficult to interpret it. So I can hear a person speaking, for example, in fluent French, and I may catch up a word here and there because I'm exposed to a little bit of French, but most of what they say is going to be beyond me. Other languages as well, but not just other languages, but other cultures. And the culture in which the New Testament was written was a far different culture than the culture in which we live today. I noticed on Facebook this past week, Facebook is an interesting thing that I've got to get off of sooner or later because it's destroying my attitude. I have about 4,400 friends on my Facebook account, and approximately 3,000 of them are idiots. I'm just not sure which 3,000 it is, or maybe I'm one of those 3,000 who is the idiot. Because after the election, you should have seen the vitriol, actually before it even happened, but particularly after the election, the vitriol, the anger, the hatred that was spewing across the social media, saying all kinds of mean things, often by people who represent themselves as being dedicated and loving followers of Jesus. Fascinating to me. Absolutely fascinating. And then I saw this one, a young lady that I know. She's actually a very bright young lady. She actually made a post. She put on there, actually it was after a post that I had made, and she said, I'm beginning to wonder if America is still a Christian nation. And I wondered why she ever thought it was. You say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean? Isn't America a Christian nation? I don't know that there isn't such thing as a Christian nation. I mean, we are a nation full of people, many of whom are Christians, but not as many as it used to be proportionally. You do understand that the Pew Research came out just a few weeks ago that said for the first time in American history, fewer than 50% of Americans identified themselves as being Protestants. Actually, that word doesn't make sense anymore because most people who would be classified as Protestants aren't protesting anything. You see, Protestants meant those who were protesting the Catholic Church, and most of us don't know enough about the Catholic Church to protest or not. So it's still called Protestants. And I was listening as I was riding in the morning. I was flipping channels on my radio because being a male, I can't listen to anything more than 30 seconds, television, radio, whatever else. We have very limited attention spans. Have you guys figured that out? And I'm flipping through the radio, and I hear these two guys, and one is a seminarian. He teaches at a seminary, and the other is a Christian, but he's also a pollster. And they were talking about that Pew Research that said that less than 50% of Americans now identify themselves as Christian Protestant Christians. And then they talked about the increasing number of Americans who identify themselves as being none, N-O-N-E, none, meaning I have no religious preference at all. And as they were talking about it, these pollsters, they said, our research shows that these are not people who no longer believe in God. There has not been a dramatic increase in atheists or agnostics. These are people who still would say that they're Christian, but they are nones, and that's what we refer to actually now as nones, because they are just fed up with church. And therefore they don't want to be identified with any church. They went on to explain for a while as to why that was occurring, according to the polls, according to the research, the surveys that they did. They said a great number of people in America who would still believe that God is and that Jesus is the Son of God no longer want to associate with the church because of the political encroaching into churches. So that many pulpits now, rather than preaching about the gospel of Jesus, preach about various political subjects, and people have just become fed up with that and gone out and become nones. If they're right, they said, that something would change dramatically if churches ever went back to building community rather than being full of political rhetoric, because people are looking for the answer in Jesus, not the answer in anybody else. And so when Terry said earlier that it's not going to be a donkey or an elephant, but a lamb, which is a great quote, I would say it this way. If you're not happy about the way the United States of America is headed, and I'm not, I'm 63. That gives me enough history of actually having been here to say that I think that our country actually has degraded somewhat. Now, you could disagree and feel free to. I'm certainly not the expert. But it seems like it's not as good a world now as it was 50 years ago when I was 13. Now, some things are better. The racial prejudice that existed when I was 13 and the way people were treated because their skin was a different color was atrocious. It was terrible. I never want us to go back to that. The way that women were treated 50 years ago, I don't claim that people of color or people who are female have true equality yet. I don't think you really do. But it's a whole lot better than it was 50 years ago. A whole lot better. And so there are ways in which our country has become much better. But then you look around and start looking at the morality of our country and what people do and what's acceptable for people to do. As a matter of fact, that nobody gets upset about anymore. Now, for those who have ever seen the old black and white versions of I Love Lucy, anybody ever seen those? No, that's just good comedy. What made it funny? Well, they had to be, because they couldn't rely on bathroom humor or vulgar words, so they had to be really funny. Did you ever notice the bed that they slept in? There wasn't a bed that they slept in. There were two beds. He was in one, she was in another, because it was considered to be disgraceful to show a couple in the same bed on television back in those days. As a matter of fact, when she became pregnant with their real son, the one on the TV show was not their real son, he was an actor, but when she became pregnant with her real son, they didn't know about what they might have to take the series off the air, because they just didn't know if the American public could handle seeing a pregnant woman on television. That was just going to be vulgar. Now, not only will you see them in the same bed, but you'll see them making the pregnancy right on television, right now. And you look at that and go, but our younger culture has gotten to the point where it's like, well, that's no big deal. And some of the things that we believe, or at least I say we, I must mean me, some of the things that I believe and that I would preach and teach from the pulpit are not only considered to be passé, but if you start examining and researching with teenagers, for example, teenagers in evangelical churches. These would be churches that consider themselves to be Bible-based churches. And you start questioning their views of morality through these surveys and researches. Some of the things that they would say are acceptable before God, I would say it's not acceptable here. So why did it become acceptable here? And so there are things going on in our country that do scare me for the morality of our children. What they're being exposed to, the things they're told that are right and wrong, and etc. And then some of those people who claim Christianity make it a lot worse because they're so fanatically on the right that everything they say is so absurd that it makes people think, well, what they're saying can't have any truth to it because only nuts talk like that. So I think that sometimes some of the Christians who have been so vitriolic have actually aided the other side being whoever's pulling people away from Christianity by the way that we behave. Am I totally off base, or does anybody see some of these things happening as well? So in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, therefore, Rid yourselves of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Okay, it's telling me to live right. I shouldn't be doing those kinds of things. I shouldn't be doing things to hurt other people. That's what malice is. I shouldn't be deceiving other people. Hypocrisy, that's acting one way and then actually doing another. He goes on and says, like newborn babes, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. Know that you have tasted that the Lord is good. Now that you have tasted the Lord is good. Now he goes on talking about that. And beginning in verse 4, he starts painting a picture that I think somehow we've overlooked. As you come to him, the living stone. He calls him the stone here because he's the stone in which the house is built. Okay, he's the cornerstone, the most important part of the construction. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by humans but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. How many times in that passage do you see the word spiritual? Now, please understand, I said it to begin with, and I'll reiterate it just to make sure you're here. Everything I'm saying through the context of my being proud to being American. I love my country. I am proud of my country. I am proud of the people that serve our country. So please don't hear me in any way trying to put down America. I am definitely not, or any other country. But when he talks of the Christians, try to read it with the eyes of the people who read it first. These were people who lived basically under Roman domination. The Romans weren't the most moral people on the planet. Now, they weren't quite as bad as some of the movies tend to make them, but they were not the most moral people on the planet, and they certainly didn't serve the God of heaven, not at this point at least. They were serving the various gods and etc. And to these people, and as this letter would circulate, it wouldn't just go to people who lived in Israel. It would go to people who lived in Asia. It would go to people who lived in parts of Europe. It would go to places all over the world. And each of these Christians who would read this letter would actually be serving under various governments in various places, many of whom were dominated by the Romans, some of whom were not. But he certainly weren't all in the same country like America. Now, what does he say to these people? He said, you are spiritual stones, and you're made to be, if we'll put that verse back up there, a spiritual house, a holy priesthood offering spiritual sacrifices. What are you trying to tell us? That we are a different people. What do you mean? Okay. Let's look at verse 9 beginning, gentlemen. For you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Now, catch that first part of that. You are a chosen people. Put the next verse up there. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. What he's saying is, at one point you were either Jews or Romans or Corinthians or Galatians or Ephesians, based on where you live. And the Christians weren't a people, because Christians didn't exist. And so you had your nationality in whichever country that you lived. But God chose you. Now, you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. So where is my first citizenship? My first citizenship has to be in the kingdom of heaven. That's what he's telling me here, because I am now part of a spiritual kingdom, a spiritual house, making spiritual sacrifices to God, and my allegiance then would come first to my God before any nation in which I lived, whatever that nation might be. So then come down to verse 13. There you go. I'm 63. I'm reading that a lot easier than I'm reading this. Okay. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority. Now, these people lived in various places, and some of these governments were pretty corrupt. Pretty corrupt. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor. Let me just stop and say, if you could possibly go to another country and stop and read this there, it might make better sense. How many of you have traveled to some country outside the United States of America? Okay, a good number of people. I'm certainly not a well-traveled person. I have been to parts of Asia, I have been to Africa. Just the only time in Europe was a change of plane, and I've also been all the way out to Texas. Speaking of Texas, I really don't. It doesn't bother me. It really doesn't. I was one time in Dallas, though, and didn't realize how much the Aggies are sensitive about being made fun of. I told a joke I had heard at a restaurant. And when I went out, after I paid and went out, this guy followed me out, and he said, I went to A&M, and I'm offended by that joke. And I said, it was just a joke I heard. I don't even know what it means. He pulled a razor on me. And if he could have found a place to plug it in, he'd have cut me. All right, so. I'm kidding. I'm absolutely kidding. You guys remember who Gene Stallings was by any chance? He still is. He's still alive. Gene's a great guy. I hate it when he hugs me because my head comes to his chest. He's just this gigantic guy. When Gene Stallings was coach at Alabama, they won the national championship in 1992. Jake Barker was their quarterback, who was also a friend of mine. Shortly after they won that national championship, they interviewed Gene Stallings and said, do you ever pray to win a football game? To which he wisely replied, I think God has a lot more to worry about than who wins a football game. So I really have nothing against the Aggies, and my partner that underwrites our company is an Aggie, so go Aggies. All right. If you read from a different world, let's say, for example, you were in the country of Benin. Benin is in West Africa, right next to Togo. That's gone to the next nation over. It's been a while since I've been there, but the last time I was in Benin, they had a brand new, wonderful government building that was empty. They spent millions of dollars to build it, but nobody lived in it. You say, why not? Because the regime at that point, now this was several years ago, so who knows what now, but the regime at that point believed that demons had occupied that building, therefore they were not about to go in it, and so it sat empty. Now, that was millions of dollars spent in a country where there's a great deal of poverty on a building that's not being used. And the next city over, or next state over, next country over, Togo, actually went by a school. It looked like everything was great because all the kids were wearing uniforms, and I thought, wow, that's pretty unique. And then I found out that in that school they had 4,000 students and they had 64 books. 64 books for 4,000 students. When the kids asked for things, when we ran into them, they didn't ask for money, they didn't ask for toys, they asked for pencils and paper because they wanted to learn how to write. And they wanted to learn how to read. In both those countries, both Togo and Benin, the armies are not paid. As a matter of fact, I read on them before I went up there, over there. I read as much as I possibly could, and they said, do not be surprised if you're not ripped off by the army, because the armies in both of those countries live by ripping off the population. And if you want a missionary moment to remember, be in an automobile, stopped in the middle of the night. By the way, there are no lights around anywhere. The only lights are on the headlights. Be stopped by drunken soldiers, you can smell the alcohol in their breath, who would stick the barrel of AK-47s through your window and want money. Submit yourselves, for the Lord's sake, to every human authority. Would you believe that's applicable to the people in Togo, where the army is totally corrupt? Well, was it applicable to the people in Rome? Okay, now the answer is yes, shake your head this way. If the answer is no, shake your head that way. Was it applicable to the people in Rome? The answer is yes. By our standards, was the government corrupt? The answer is yes. You say, he expects us to submit ourselves to the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, next verse, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. Look at the next verse. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to paraphrase the rest of the chapter. You know what he said? You may be punished by these governments for being good. If you're going to be punished, make sure it's for that reason. So that when you're punished for doing good, the way you react to it will reflect on God positively. You can read the verses, they're there. I'm just out of time. But if you do wrong and they punish you, you're not reflecting anything positive about God at all. What does he mean? I truly do love being an American. In my brief travels to other parts of the world, I'd come back to this nation every time. Now, there's some countries that I like. I love Canada, and they're so blooming polite up there. I think it's a disease they have, that they're all just nice. I'm not kidding. One time, I actually held a door for a lady, and she asked me if I was Canadian. I am not making that up. No, ma'am, I'm just being nice. I really like the country of Australia. I would go back into Australia as much as I possibly could. The only thing wrong is they just travel on the wrong side of the road. And they have the Queen on their money. Other than that, it's a great country. By the way, I did discover that if you drive on the right side of the road, they'll move off the wrong side of the road in a hurry. I also learned Australian profanity. The idea is, I love living here. But it says that I'm supposed to submit to the government. Now, I'm going to throw a couple of questions at you to think about, just to see if you want to think this week, and if you don't, that's fine. These are just questions to think about. Based on these principles, I listened to a preacher recently who said, he was asked the question, is it okay for a Christian to serve in the military? My answer would be the same as his, yes. They asked him then, can a Christian go to war as part of the military? Believe it or not, my answer to that would be yes. But then he gave a caveat. He said, as long as it's a just war. He said, so if you're fighting for an army that's just being one that's trying to push their tyranny out further, or to take a country from somebody else, then as a Christian you can't fight in that war. Now that sounds reasonable from an American logical way of thinking. So let's think back to this country. If you were a soldier back in the late 1800s, middle 1800s on, and you were part of the U.S. cavalry, and they were sent to the West to move the Indians and to kill them if they didn't obey, is that a just war? Based on what he just said, no. If you had been part of the army that took the Cherokees from the eastern part of Tennessee and marched them all the way to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, where they were dying by the side of the road, would that have been a just thing to do? Most of us would say no. Has everything that's happened in every war that America has participated in been a just war? By his definition, the answer is no. He said, what's your point? I don't think the individual soldier can make those decisions in most cases. We don't know the motives of the politicos. We don't even know the motives of all of our generals. I think it comes down to the individual who says, I can do this because I'm obeying, or what I've been asked to do is in such contradiction to my belief and value system, I cannot do it at all, and therefore you disobey. You said then a soldier can disobey? I think if he or she is facing a situation that violates what he or she believes God wants you to do, he has to disobey. But I'd go back to 1 Peter 2 and say, if you're going to get punished, be punished for doing something good. Don't be punished for doing something bad. I don't want to stand in detention. If we punish you for that, it's your fault. I'm with Lieutenant Calley in Malay. I wasn't there. Illustration. Vietnam. Remember this story? Where he had his platoon kill nearly 300 civilians. Others of our army arrived, realized what he was doing, and threatened to shoot him if he didn't stop the massacre. We punished him. He got 24 months house arrest in Columbus, Georgia. If I was one of those soldiers, would I have blatantly killed civilians just because a maniacal lieutenant wanted them dead? I think then that has to become my decision. And I'm not sure that I always have enough information to know. I don't know what the lieutenant knows. I don't know what the captain knows. I don't know what the major knows. I don't know what the general knows. Well, I skipped the colonel, didn't mean to. I don't know what they all know. So what about the soldiers then? The airmen, the Marines, the seamen. I think you serve your country. You obey up until the point when you say, I can't do this because of who I am. Oh, wait a minute. You're a citizen. That's right. but my primary citizenship is in heaven. Therefore, I will serve in any way I possibly can till it violates what I believe is right. Then I cannot. And if you punish me, you punish me. You say, are you trying to make our veterans feel bad? Absolutely not. I'm actually encouraging them. I think most things that most military people do, they do because they were ordered to, and that's exactly right. That's what they should have done. If you ever choose not to obey, it better be an exception. You better know what you're doing if you do choose to disobey. But what does it say about President Obama? What does it say about the new Congress? What does it say about them, etc.? They will not change America. It has never been the responsibility of the politicians to change this country for the good. It has always been the responsibilities of the Christians living in a country to change it for the good. And whether they are Christians or not, I don't know. I know that all kinds of religious claims are made by people who are running for office, but I also know they make all kinds of other claims. Some of them, I'm convinced, are genuine and true. Some of them are lying. I just don't know the difference. But I don't need to be the liar. I need to be true. And I think we do a whole lot better rather than spewing our vitriol toward the political party that we don't agree with, or toward some politician that we think may be an idiot, if we stand up and say, Jesus is my Lord. I'm not going to be mean and maniacal. I'm going to have some balance to my life, but I'm going to stand up for what I believe is right. And if churches full of people who do love Jesus could do that, we can, we will change the morality course of this country. But it's not a Christian country. It's a country with Christians in it, and Muslims and Jews and Buddhists. We all live here. Do we not? If we believe we're right, let's show it. And what's the greatest example? Jesus said, they'll know you're mine by the way you love. Love. If we can help you, make your need known by when you stand and sing.